Hey, let's go ahead and get started. Probably people will still drift in, but I wanted to introduce everyone to Dr. Clive Wynne, who's a Ph.D. He's from Edinburgh University, and he's been all over the place at Ruhr-Universitat Bochum, Duke University, Universitat Konstanz, and University of Western Australia and the University of Florida, and landed at ASU in 2013. And he studied the behavior of many species. He's a comparative psychologist, ranging from pigeons to dunnarts, which are small mouse-like marsupials that they found cute. And some years ago, he found a way to meld his childhood love of dogs with his professional training and how he studies and teaches the behavior of dogs and their wild relatives. And I met Clive in a Zoom call about a month ago, in which we talked about the relationship between humans and dogs, and especially the teaming relationship. And we've been learning a lot from him ever since about this relationship and how we might be able to mimic some of that in human AI teaming. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Wynne.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, thank you for inviting me to join your group. I must confess, when you first reached out, I was a bit puzzled as to where the point of connection might be, but I'm beginning to understand better, and particularly after your fascinating brief presentations yesterday afternoon. That was very interesting and eye-opening for me, and I can begin to see a bit better why looking at dogs might offer a perspective that you could find useful. Now, before I get too far in, let me just treble check. You'd like about an hour of me talking and then 20 minutes of Q&A. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
okay. Good.
That's fine.
Good. I'm pretty hopeless at timing talks, I'm afraid, partly because I never seem to give the same talk twice, but we can improvise as we go along if I get too bogged down in anecdotes. So yeah, I'm trained as a behavioral psychologist, a comparative psychologist, someone who's interested in comparing the behavior of different species. And I did that in a variety of animals, as Nancy said, for a number of years, decades. And it sort of embarrasses me in a way that it took me such a long time to realize that I ought to be studying dogs. Because I'm not just interested in animal behavior. I am very interested in animal behavior. But at a point, I don't know, probably about 20 years ago now, I realized that I was not only interested in how animals behave, which is a fascinating question, fascinating problem, but also how people and other species interact. And that began to kind of like gnaw at me, as I say, about 20 years ago. And it's embarrassing to admit that it then took me several more years before I realized that I ought to be studying dogs. Because in retrospect, for somebody with my set of interests, obviously I ought to be studying dogs, because there is no animal with which humans have had a longer relationship than with the dog. The origin of the dog is quite controversial among archaeologists and geneticists and genomicists and archaeogeneticists and archaeogenomicists. But the origin of the dog lies at least 15,000 years ago. That is the most recent estimate. The most recent estimate is 15,000. Some people say 35,000. But it doesn't matter, because even 15,000 years ago means that dogs are not just the first domesticated animal, they are the first domesticated anything. There were dogs, people often say dogs. What about cats, Dr. Wynne? Cats were only domesticated 4,000 years ago. There have been dogs for 10,000 years before there were domestic cats. There were dogs thousands of years before there was cattle, before there was sheep, before there were pigs. There were dogs thousands of years before there was wheat, before there was barley. So humans and dogs have a relationship going back longer than our intimate relationship with any other species. Over that period of time, people and dogs have worked alongside each other closely for thousands of years, and there's no animal with which people at large have a more intimate relationship than with their dogs. When I talk to groups of dog enthusiasts, back in the olden days when we all used to get together in one room to give and listen to a talk, If I'm talking to a lay group, I ask for a show of hands. How many of you have a dog? Now, in the population at large, nearly half of all households in the United States have a dog. If you go to a talk about dogs that I give, it's likely that the whole room raises their hand that they have a dog. And then I say, well, keep your hand up if you let your dog sleep on your bed. And in the population at large, about half of all dog owners let their dogs sleep on their bed. And in the kinds of groups that come to talks when I gave public talks, 2/3 or 3/4 of the room keep their hand up. And then I keep the joke going and I say, well, so how many people are you willing to share your bed with? And of course, that gets a chuckle from an audience because it's a funny thing to think about. And I don't actually ask anybody to give me an answer. I just say, I'm going to guess the number is not large, right? Your bed is one of the most private and intimate spaces in your life. It's a space that most of us are not willing to share with many other members of our own species. And yet here we are letting this animal, this member of a completely different species, this animal which our zoologist friends tell us doesn't deserve to be considered its own species. It's considered a subspecies of wolf. It's a carnivore. And so many people let it share their most intimate space. So because this is something that we experience every day, we take it for granted. But I'd like you to stop and think about just how remarkable it is that this animal got into that space in our lives. And okay, having dogs sleep on your bed, lots of older people will say, well, when I was a kid, the dog wasn't allowed in the bedroom, you know, or when I was a kid, the dog had to sleep in a hut outdoors. Or somebody in the audience who has visited or lived in some less wealthy part of the world than the United States or Northwestern Europe will say, well, where I come from or where I live, the dogs are all outside on the street. All of that is true. All of that is true. That our way of living with dogs in our first world pocket of wealth is not typical of how dogs live around the world. But I'm here to tell you that actually people from many different cultures at many different points in human history and at many different locations around the globe do show affection and a connection with dogs. Okay, well, I've already somehow used up 10 minutes without moving on to the first slide. So, hopeless at timing talks. Okay, so I'm not the first person to ask what could be the secret of dog success in a human-dominated world. How did dogs have to get to have this privileged relationship with human beings? And very, very quickly, when I first came into this, which is 15 to 20 years ago now, there had been a revival of study on this question, and a couple of scientists had proposed that dogs had developed special social cognitive skills, human-like social cognitive skills that gave them a unique ability among animals to understand people's intentions. And I don't think this is true, and I'm not going to spend much time going back over this, which to me is old stuff. We could talk about it if you're interested. The Brian Hare at Duke University is the primary author of this theory of dog success. And there are many different tasks that you might use to test dogs' human-like social cognitive skills. The most widely used is very simple. You could easily try it on your own dog. You just point and you see if your dog goes where you point. This frame grab from a video shows you one of my past students, Monique Udell, now on the faculty at Oregon State University. She's doing that. She's pointing at a container. There's a dog in the room. The dog will be released. And most of the time, the dog will go where the human points. If you test pet dogs, dogs that live with human beings, that were raised with human beings, they usually go where you point. I don't deny that for a moment. What I deny is that there's anything especially unique about dogs in their ability to do this. The most interesting comparison is to compare the performance of dogs with the performance of hand-reared wolves. All of our dogs are descended from wolves. If they have any unique abilities, those abilities should not be present in wolves. We were invited out to a wolf sanctuary in Indiana, Wolf Park, where they've been hand-rearing wolves since 1974. So they're very, very good. They have the most beautiful human-oriented wolves you'll likely find anywhere in the world. And we repeated the experiment out there, this very simple task. We just point at something and see if the animal goes where you point. And we found that actually wolves were every bit as good at this as were the best dogs. So this is not something that's unique to dogs. In fact, not all dogs do it. We tested dogs at an animal shelter, and most of the animal shelter dogs did not spontaneously follow human pointing gestures, but they could learn to do it very, very quickly. And the student who was on the previous slide, Monique Udell, she recently published a review, and she has identified 38 different species that if they are reared by human beings and live with human beings, that's crucial, then certain members of 38 different species can follow human pointing gestures. So that's a long story that I've cut extremely short. You can ask me more about it if you like, but I do not believe that dogs have any particular special cognitive skills that give them a special ability to understand human actions and intentions. Now, I'm not for a moment denying that my dog here, just like your dogs in your homes, are exquisitely sensitive to what you're doing. But what I'm arguing is that that exquisite sensitivity stems from that animal's circumstances of life. That individual animal's, my dog Zephos, and the life she has led is what makes her so sensitive to what I do. It's not because of her belonging to this subspecies we call dog, right? If I had a pet lion or a pet tiger or a pet wolf, which would be deeply inadvisable things to do, don't get me wrong. If I had a wild type animal and I had successfully tamed it, I think, and there is evidence that shows, that that animal would also be very sensitive to what I'm doing. It's about an individual's life, not about their species or subspecies membership. Okay. So if I don't think that that's the secret of dog success, what do I believe is the secret of dog success? And I think the secret of dog success lies in emotional connection with people. Love, or to use more technical terms, sociability and attachment. And we can look at two sides of that. One is people being attracted to dogs, and the other is dogs being attracted to people. I'm not going to say much about the first topic because partially because, to be honest, it only relatively recently crossed my mind that we ought to try and understand that. And in my defense, very few other people have thought it was worth trying to understand either. So there's very little we could say about that. The present state of science is very thin. I will say more about the second subtopic, how dogs are attracted to people. So I mentioned that the way we live with dogs here in one of the world's wealthiest corners is not typical. There are perhaps up to 1 billion dogs on the surface of this planet. Only 300 or 400 million of them live as pets in first world countries. Hundreds of millions of them live in developing countries, much poorer parts of the world. Here is a picture of some dogs on the streets of a town, a city in West Bengal in India. In India, dogs are all over the streets. Some people have pet dogs as well. The man in this photograph is Sunil Pal, who has published a number of papers on the lives of street dogs where he lives in India. His papers are very high quality, and he has won an award from the Animal Behavior Society, which is the main international scholarly society for the study of animal behavior. He's actually a high school teacher in India who studies the dogs around his home. I just want to draw attention to one small part of his findings, which I think is something we should think about, and that is that dogs living on the streets in West Bengal in India, they have catastrophic infant mortality. I say catastrophic, that's putting it a bit emotionally. They have high infant mortality. About 82% of dogs die in their first year of life, which of course is not untypical of wild animals, but it's a lot compared to pets. Very few researchers take any interest in free-living dogs on the streets of developing countries, so there's not a lot of data on this, but there have been studies. There are free-living dogs in Italy, in the south of Italy, And there was a fairly big study where they radio tracked 9 dogs over 4 years. Over that 4-year period, these 9 dogs gave birth to 40 pups. Only 2 of those 40 pups reached their first birthday. So the suggestion from Italy is an even higher rate of infant mortality in free-living dogs than Sunil Pal observed in West Bengal. I have never studied free-living dogs. The closest I can claim is that I've visited a couple of places where dogs live on the streets freely. And I had a very interesting few days in the Bahamas, which is, it's not as wealthy as the United States, but you wouldn't call the Bahamas a third world nation. It's a middle income nation. And the fact that they have dogs all over the streets is more to do with a cultural attitude than anything about their level of wealth. The people of the Bahamas have a very positive attitude to dogs that live on their streets for a variety of historical reasons. And I spent a day going around the back streets of Nassau with an officer from the Bahamas Humane Society. And I also spent some time chatting to a professor at the College of the Bahamas who was interested in the dogs, William Fielding. And you see dogs everywhere. This is a beautiful dog hanging out by a home. And we talked about, there's no formal study done, but we chatted about how the infant mortality in Nassau of these dogs, even though the climate is fairly gentle, even though the people have a very positive attitude towards the dogs on their streets, nonetheless, the mortality is very, very high, and probably just as high as in India or in Italy. And William Fielding and I, we were talking about this, and Fielding said to me that he had the sense that the secret to a pup's success in life was if its mother, so the mother, I should mention, there's no co-parental care, there's no father, no paternal care in dogs. Mothers nurse their pups for about 8 weeks, which, given that it's difficult for them to forage while they're nursing and nobody is helping them, nobody's bringing them food while they're nursing, 8 weeks is all they can manage. At the end of 8 weeks, they kick their pups out. And it's probably at that point that most of the pups die. Dogs survive on the streets by scavenging on human trash. Scavenging on human trash is not difficult, but 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-week-old pups are still not that coordinated. They're not that good at scavenging food. And so that's when they're most likely to die. And William Fielding had this thought that when the mother weans the pups and kicks them away from herself so that she can recover her own body weight, most of the pups that survive, if they're going to survive, it's because the mother dumps them near a human household that doesn't already have a dog that it's caring for. And this got us to talking about how physically attractive puppies are. And my colleagues tease me, right? They tease me. I always have plenty of undergraduates want to help with my research projects. And my colleagues, they say, well, Clive, that's because all you really do is cuddle puppies. Well, it's true, we do spend a certain amount of time cuddling puppies, but it's not the only thing we do. But certainly there's a point there, right? It's a cliche, it's something everybody acknowledges. Puppies and kittens, they're very, very attractive. They're very attractive. Well, many, many years ago, the founder of ethology and Nazi, Konrad Lorenz, proposed that we human beings are attracted to the young of all species. And being a German speaker, he called this Kindchenschema, which is usually rendered in English as like baby features or infantile schema. The idea being that the young of all species have certain visual qualities in their faces in common, and that we human beings, having evolved presumably to care for our own young, we can be triggered by the young of other species because they share identifiable qualities with the young of our own species. And these qualities include babies tend to have larger eyes proportional to their face, smaller noses, and cute little mouths, right? And I've been aware of this for a long, long time, since I was an undergraduate myself. And I've never studied it before, but it has often struck me that there must be something at least a little bit wrong with this theory. Because when you're actually talking about newborn infants, like when my own son was born, if you've ever seen a truly newborn human baby, they're not that cute. They're wrinkly, and people joke about how newborn babies are not that cute. It takes a few weeks for a baby to grow into its attractiveness. And the same, I think, could well be true in other species. Newborn dog pups don't seem to me to be as cute as they become after a few weeks or months. And so I thought it would be interesting to look at this question and see whether it's possible to be too young to be cute. And I had the good fortune some years ago now that there was an undergraduate working with me who had friends who bred dogs from several different breeds, and she was able to get hold of photographs of dog puppies from 3 breeds from birth until 7 months of age. And for the first few weeks of life, we were able to get a photograph every week of life. And so we have these 3 different breeds, fairly diverse in shape and color. We have dense sets of photographs, and we just do one of those kinds of studies that people in psychology are always doing. We show people a photograph on a computer screen, and there's a slider underneath, and we ask them to slide the slider to indicate to us how attractive they think that puppy looks. And what I'm interested to see is it possible to be too young to be cute, which is a question of no particular scientific importance in itself. But what I'm especially interested in is, could it be that puppy attractiveness to people peaks at around the age of weaning, where human intervention in their lives could have the biggest impact on their future survival? So we show people the pictures, we record the results. This is what the results look like. So here's the Jack Russell Terrier. The age of the puppy is along the x-axis. How attractive on average a group of undergraduate students rated these puppies goes up the y-axis. And we then fit a function to this, and the peak of the function for the Jack Russell Terrier is at 7.7 weeks. So in other words, yeah, it comes out just as I sort of thought it might. The puppy cuteness, attractiveness to human perceivers peaks just at the age of weaning, which is the point where if we could do this experiment on the mother dogs, if we could ask the mothers, how cute is this puppy? Her function would have to be the reverse of this, or at least as we see in her behavior, once a puppy reaches 8 weeks, she wants nothing more to do with it. She physically pushes it away. She moves away from her puppies. She rejects her puppies at that age. So this could be a signal of co-adaptation, or perhaps parasitism. This could be a hint that humans are sort of parasitized by dogs. So the Jack Russell Terrier, 7.7 weeks. The Cane Corso, which in case you don't realize is a large, what's the word? You know, a big beefy dog from South America. Sorry, beefy is not the technical term. The peak of the function is a little bit younger, but you can see that basically the function is the same, with a peak around the same point. And then the White Shepherd, which is just a German Shepherd dog in a white fur, that has a peak that's very slightly higher. So people are attracted to dogs most intensely precisely at the point where human intervention in their lives could make the biggest difference. And I won't spend much time on this, but particularly when I'm talking to lay groups, it's kind of fun to actually show people what puppies look like who are proven by science to be the cutest they could possibly be. So those are the 3 at their peak cuteness, between 6 and 8 weeks for the different breeds of dog. The newborns are the least attractive at the younger end, and the oldest dogs are the least attractive in the older direction. And I think you would agree that if you look up and down the columns and somebody gave you a choice of a newborn, an 8-week-old, or a 7-month-old, you would say, yes, the weanling pup is the cutest if you look up and down the columns. But I think it's also true that if you developed a bond with a puppy at that point where it is most appealing to you, that you would hold on to it as it gets older. I mean, you would continue to care for it. Although in the context of a street dog, continuing care from humans is not necessary. They can forage for food on their own on the streets. So human attraction to dogs peaks around weaning, just when human intervention could have the biggest impact on their lives. What does that do for them? What does dogs' reciprocal attractiveness with people, what does that achieve for them? You've got to think that, again, on a global scale today, most of the world's dogs are not pets, but they live on streets, and they are not hunters in the woods either. Very few dogs survive by hunting. Relatively few dogs, a minority of dogs, survive by living inside human homes as pets. On a global scale today, most dogs are scavengers. And historically, it would have been the case that more dogs were scavengers. Scavenging came before they became pets. Having a relationship with people enables dogs to scavenge much more from human trash than other animals that don't so easily form relationships with people can scavenge. And this can be measured in something called the flight distance, which is a very simple concept. An animal is out in nature or wherever the animal is found. The experimenter walks very slowly towards the animal and observes at what point does that animal flee from the approaching human being. Unfortunately, this has never been done on dogs and wolves in the same locality, even though there are parts of the world where dogs and wolves both scavenge on human trash in the same locations. This happens in Israel, it happens in Scandinavia, it happens in Canada or Alaska. It's never been studied in the same location. But flight distance has been measured in wolves in Scandinavia, and in dogs, well, we'll come to dogs. Wolves in Scandinavia, scavenging on trash dumps, experimenter walks slowly towards the wolf. The wolf flees already on average when the experimenter is 200 meters away. Dogs, well, flight distance hardly applies to our pet dogs. If you came to visit me, my dog would not flee from you. There would be no flight distance. She would actually seek you out and make contact with you. Scavenging dogs are not quite as engaged with people. And there's a study from Ethiopia of dogs scavenging around the edges of villages in Ethiopia. And in that study, it was found that the dogs would flee from an approaching stranger when that person was 5 meters away. If you think about the scavenging lifestyle and you think about the different animals that scavenge on human trash dumps, an animal that runs away when there's a human being within 200 meters of a trash dump is not going to extract anything like as much resource from that trash dump as an animal that waits until the human is just 5 meters away before it flees. So dogs' reciprocal attraction with people gains them the ability to get many more resources from us because they do not flee at anything like the same rate. And this slide is perhaps a little bit out of order, but it would have made sense to have put this in earlier. But it's interesting to think that although as I'm talking about this, and if you're here in Tempe where I am, or if you're elsewhere in the United States, you're not thinking of the animals scavenging is something you may never have seen, or you only see very, very sporadically. It's very rare in a first world nation to see animals scavenging today. But it wasn't that long ago. There's a wonderful book from 1973 called The Ecology of Stray Dogs by Alan Beck. And this was based on Beck's Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins University. He was just studying dogs that were all over Baltimore in the late 1960s. We didn't eradicate them from US cities until the late 60s, early 70s. And these are just a couple of black and white photographs from that epoch. Okay, so flight distance, human attractiveness to dogs. What makes it possible for dogs to so easily form relationships with people? I don't know, I guess you have diverse backgrounds, so excuse me if I'm telling you things you already know, but no animal is born knowing what species it belongs to. So here's a lifeline from birth to death. We don't know how long it goes. No animal is born knowing what species it belongs to. Animals are born and they enter a phase of life, which when I'm talking to lay groups, I call the taming phase, because we're talking about dogs. But the technical term for this is the critical period for social imprinting. And this was another of the great discoveries of the Nazi Konrad Lorenz, And you may, perhaps in your undergraduate education, depending what your major was, you may have seen old black and white movies, they're on YouTube now, of this guy, Konrad Lorenz, being followed around by young geese, by goslings. Why do they follow him around? They follow him around because they think he's their mother, which is to say, he was the first being they saw when they hatched. When a young goose or duck hatches, or any bird, they look around themselves, and whatever they see when they are newly hatched, they form a bond or a potential to bond with beings that look like that. And so Lorenz demonstrated this on birds, but it's equally true of mammals as well. It's true of our own species too, by the way. It's hardly imaginable that anybody could be born and not see human beings, but if they did, they would fail to develop normal social relationships with human beings. In our dogs, the critical period for social imprinting appears to last perhaps 3 months. It ends when an animal shows fear reactions to novel stimuli. So whatever a dog sees, smells, hears, in its first 3 months of life, whatever living things it sees in that period, it will be inclined for the rest of its life to form social connections with those kinds of beings. The critical period for social imprinting in dogs, the taming period, is so long that many people are not aware that every individual dog pup has to be socialized to human beings early in life, or it will not accept human beings as social companions later in life. And I'm going to come to a very old experiment about that. Meanwhile, when you look at wolves, the wild ancestors of our dogs, the critical period for social imprinting only lasts about 3 weeks. The studies on dogs are old and not high quality. The studies on wolves are even worse. But it's probably going to be something like 3 weeks, the critical period for social imprinting in wolves. Now, what that means is that it's extremely difficult to convince a wolf to form social relationships with human beings. Because after all, the wolf pup is still nursing in those first 3 weeks of life. The mother is not keen to let you get close to its pups. So it's very difficult to hand rear a wolf. But it's important to realize that the situation with the wolf is the normal situation. I'm sorry if this offends anybody, but all that stuff that you saw when you were a little kid, or that you show your children if you have small children in your life today, Bambi, and I don't know, all those wonderful children's stories about the animals in the forest, and they're all friends, right? They're all friends. There might be 1 or 2 evil individuals, usually human, but by and large in children's stories, the animals all get along really well. That's not true. That's not true. In nature, animals have to learn to only form social connections with members of their own species. Anything else would be disastrous, would not survive and leave offspring in the next generation, either because you're making friends with your prey species and so you won't want to eat them and you'll starve to death, or you're trying to make friends with predator species who will eat you and so you won't survive. One way or another, it's crucial that the critical period for social imprinting is only short, so that it more or less guarantees that young animals only form relationships with their own species. The dog and other domesticated animals is anomalous in having such a long critical period for social imprinting that it easily forms relationships with members of many different species. I would love to be studying this in more detail, but it's ethically difficult. I'll tell you about the experiment that was done 70 years ago, where dog pups were reared in isolation except for 1 week of their lives, which was between week 2 and week 8 or 9. During that 1 week, they were taken out and played with by people for 90 minutes a day. And then once they were young adults, they measured what's on the y-axis. We don't need to worry about the details. They measured how comfortable these dogs were around people. And what you can see from this is a couple of things. One is that if you take the dogs out, 90 minutes a day is much less human interaction than a dog pup would normally get, and yet it's enough to ensure that the dogs are comfortable around people. The 2, 3, 5, 7, 9-week-old pups, they all show evidence of being fairly comfortable around people. So it doesn't take much human exposure for a dog to be adequately socialized to human beings. The 14-week-old pups, however, the dogs who were not given human exposure until they were 14 weeks old, they were deeply uncomfortable around people. The text of the description of this experiment refers to them as being like little wild animals. And there was nothing they could do that would bring these dogs to be comfortable around people. And in my book, Dog is Love, I speculate that they euthanized these dogs, which is what makes this ethically problematic, because what could you do with a dog that's not comfortable around human beings? There's no role in our society for such a dog. Back in the 1960s, they could bring themselves to euthanize dogs. Today, I'm sure I would never be given permission to do that, and I would never want to ask for permission to do that. I would never design an experiment on dogs, the outcome of which would involve euthanasia. Wolves, we don't have a good study on wolves, as I already mentioned. All we can say is that the experience of people who hand rear wolves indicates that you need to keep a human with the wolf pup 24 hours a day, every day. From the youngest you can get them off their mother's teat, which is about 10 days of age. Obviously, you bottle feed them until they're 3 weeks. So it's not a proper study. Let me very quickly mention that this is not, although we are mainly concerned with dogs' relationship with human beings, it isn't intrinsically about human beings. Whatever you put the dog with, it will go on through life. Put the dog with when it's a young puppy, it will go on through life seeking out for its relationships. And so I visited a goat ranch in the northeast of Arizona just so I could get some personal experience of this. And these wonderful ranchers, the Henningers, this is a picture of their dog Tarragon resting with her kid, which means a young goat, in case you'd forgotten, on one of their livestock guarding dogs, Pierre. Why do the goat and the dog love each other like this? Well, because the dog, when it was a puppy, was kept in the goat barn. And so it grew up seeking out goats for emotional connection, the way that we are accustomed to seeing dogs seek out human beings for emotional connection. Okay, so I've been saying all along, dropping casually, that dogs have an exceptional capacity to form emotional connections with human beings. And I've talked now about how the critical period for social imprinting plays an important role in making that possible. How do we quantify dog love for people so that we can investigate it further? Well, here's a super simple test that we borrowed from an Argentinian friend, Mariana Bentasola. Here you see on the left a wolf at Wolf Park, hand-reared wolf, and on the right a dog with the dog's owner. I don't know exactly who they are. In both cases, we've marked a 1-meter circle around the seat that the human is on. And with the animal and the person have known each other for a long time. The wolf has known that young woman, Dana Drenzik, since it was a little puppy. And the dog has known the young woman for some years. I don't know exactly how long. They certainly have an emotional bond, the animal and the person. And we've separated them briefly. It only needs to be for about 10 minutes. And then we have brought the animal into the space where the person is sitting on a seat. We leave them together for just 2 minutes and we measure what portion of time does the animal spend inside the circle in close proximity to the person. And what we find when we do that is that hand-reared wolves are interested in people that they know. They spend about a quarter of the 2-minute interval inside the circle in close proximity to the person. When you do this with dogs, dogs are off the charts. Dogs spend basically the whole time inside the circle with their human being. They don't do anything else but get close to their human being. They've only been separated for a few moments, but they have this powerful drive to connect with their person. So that's one way we can measure the strength of affection between a person and a dog or a wolf as the natural comparison group to have. One other thing we can do, which Monique Udell did, is we give the animals a very simple task. So this is a Tupperware box with a nice big thick piece of rope through the lid to make it easy for a dog or a wolf to open. We call this simply a solvable task. And what we find is that you give this, you could try any of these experiments yourselves, by the way. They're quite fun to try on your own dog. If you try this with your own dog, you will almost certainly find that your dog hardly even tries, that your dog almost immediately looks around to you as if to say, help me, I don't know what to do. If you do this with a hand-reared wolf, the wolf just goes at it and breaks it open. So these two tasks give us two measures of the connection between an animal and its person. We can measure in this task how much time the animal spends looking at their person. And in the other task, we measure how much time the animal spends inside the circle with its person. Now, if, as I would like to claim, there is something fundamental about dogs that makes them more inclined to seek connection with human beings, then ultimately that ought to show up in their genetic material, in their DNA. In principle, any difference between species or subspecies or breeds or whatever has to be coded in an animal's genetic material. In practice, finding genes for behavior is extremely difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. One of them is that most behaviors are not like hair color or eye color or whatever. They're not governed by a small one gene or a small number of genes. They're typically controlled by many genes. And secondly, behavior, the way a behavior of an animal is expressed is not a direct consequence of its genes, the way my hair color is a more or less direct consequence of whatever my genes for hair color are, but also that individual's experiences through life. So how an animal behaves towards a person, as we're measuring here, obviously depends on the exact nature of that animal's relationship with that person through time, and probably that animal's interactions with people throughout its whole life. So for at least two reasons, it's extremely difficult to find genes for behaviors, especially complex behaviors like this. Nonetheless, I was kind of emboldened when it's now about a decade ago, a young geneticist, Bridget von Holt, published a study where she I mean, I don't understand genetics, so you'll have to excuse me if you know genetics better than I do. You can give yourselves the true explanation of this, but this is how I explain it. That Bridget von Holt went through the dog genome piece by piece, snip by snip, looking to see evidence of recent intense selection, which is to say, in the case of the dog, she's looking for genetic signs of the process of domestication. And these genetics papers, I find them unbelievably difficult to read, and most of it was unutterably boring. But there was this one sentence that popped out at me. They said, we observed a single SNP with a high FST value located near a gene responsible for Williams-Buren syndrome in humans, which is characterized by social traits such as exceptional gregariousness. And I thought, exceptional gregariousness? Isn't that exactly what I'm talking about with dogs? When I talk about dogs being very loving, dogs being hypersocial, my terminology matches this idea of exceptional gregariousness. So I looked into Williams-Buren syndrome. It's a very rare genetic disorder, and it's actually caused by a deletion of 28 genes on chromosome 7. So it's a very big chunk of damage to the human genetic material. And not surprisingly, since it involves so many genes, it has a wide range of phenotypic impacts. People with Williams syndrome have strange facial structure, heart deficits, intellectual disabilities, and this standout characteristic that you don't find, I believe, in any other syndrome, exceptional gregariousness. I have heard people with Williams syndrome described as like friendly drunks at a cocktail party, which is not perhaps flattering, but they're very, very lovable people, very trusting. So what happened was that Monique Udell, who I've mentioned a couple of times now, who was my student, who's now at Oregon State University, she met Bridget von Holt at a conference and they got to talking. And the outcome of that discussion was that we all collaborated on a study where Monique did behavioral testing of the kind I've shown you on dogs and wolves, sent Bridget DNA samples, just harmless mouth swabs, from the wolves and dogs she tested, and they then put the behavior in relationship with the genes, looking specifically at the 28 genes implicated in Williams syndrome. And the outcome of that was that we have found 3 genes that changed in the journey from wolf to dog that correlate with the hypersocial behavior of dogs compared to wolves. So there's WBSCR17, which Bridget had previously identified as a domestication candidate, depleted of heterozygosity in the dog, and 2 other genes that Bridget hadn't previously noted that are linked in, those genetically modified mice, the knock-in, knock-out mice, where you can directly change the genetic material of an animal and see what the impact is. In those studies in mice, these 2 genes lead directly to hypersociability in mice. And when I said that people with Williams syndrome have 28 genes knocked out, actually it can vary. Not everybody with Williams syndrome has all 28 genes deleted. And from studies of people with Williams syndrome, it's been possible to identify that these 2 genes are implicated in the hypersocial aspect, the exceptional gregariousness of Williams syndrome. So here's one of those plots that they do in genetics. The x-axis is the 28 genes in the target region, and the y-axis is the probability, the strength of the relationship, if you like, between the behavior and the genes. So I think the dogs have been selected for social compatibility. I think that's the crucial crux adaptation of dogs to human society. It's easier to imprint dogs on people than wolves. Dogs living freely have a reduced flight distance from people than wolves do. Dogs have mutations that increase their sociability. Dogs also, I think, show reduced aggression towards people, although it's surprisingly difficult to make a meaningful comparison of levels of aggression, dogs towards people and wolves towards people. Of course, hundreds of thousands of people are bitten by dogs every year. But in the United States, 330 million people, only around 3 dozen, certainly fewer than 40 people a year are ever killed by a dog. In my book, which is intended for a broad audience, I say the 80 million dogs in the United States kill fewer than 40 people a year. If those 80 million dogs were people, then given homicide rates in the United States, 80 million people would kill around 4,000 people a year. So dogs are several orders of magnitude safer than are Homo sapiens, than are people. Wolves, on the other hand, unbelievably difficult to pin down the danger of wolves to people. There are about 120,000 wolves in North America. They almost never kill anybody, but then they're usually a long, long way away from any people. I think dogs have reduced aggression towards people, but it's stunningly difficult to pin down that datum. That said, in studies that have looked at dog and wolf socialization, groups of dogs living together are more aggressive towards each other than groups of wolves are. This is a measure of the frequency of aggressive interactions. Dogs, jackals happen to be in this study as well, and wolves. And you can see that the dogs are much more frequently aggressive towards each other than are the wolves. Dogs have a similar level of aggression towards other dogs in a group as jackals do. And keeping jackals together in a group is not a very humane thing to do, because jackals are not actually group living animals. They're solitary animals, and they find living with others in a confined space very problematic. So dogs show quite a lot of aggression towards each other. Curiously, dogs show more extreme dominance than wolves do. We think of wolves as big, dangerous animals, but actually they are very tolerant of other members of their group. which is probably because they have to hunt together. A pack of wolves has to hunt together and they share the spoils of the hunt. They cannot be fighting all the time. This is a beautifully simple experiment done by a group in Austria, modern group. What you do is they at their facility have hand-reared wolves and also hand-reared dogs. And the wolves live together as a group in an enclosure outdoors, and so do the dogs. So they have very comparable dogs and wolves. In this experiment, they take two animals from the group, two dogs or two wolves, and they give them a food resource carefully calibrated to be large enough to share if you want to share, but small enough for one animal to monopolize if the dominant animal chooses to monopolize it. So these were bowls of food, size of the bowl very carefully chosen, and they were bones, size of the bone very carefully chosen for each pair of animals. So it could be shared, but it didn't have to be shared. And then what they look at is how often does the dominant, or for that matter, the subordinate animal, how often does that animal take the whole thing and refuse to share? And you can see in dogs, the dominant animal, so this is a box plot and this heavy line is the median, the dominant animal is taking the whole thing for themselves about 3/4 of the time. The subordinate animal never takes the whole thing for itself, which is more or less the definition of being dominant or subordinate. That's in dogs. In wolves, look at this in wolves. In wolves, the dominant animal monopolizes the food item less than 10% of the time. What is that? Probably about 5, 6, 7% of the time. Of course, the subordinate animal never monopolizes it. So dogs actually show more aggression in groups to each other, and they show more dominance over each other, which is a bit surprising and a bit puzzling. And I'm still not myself completely sure how to put these pieces together. So dogs are easier to imprint on people. They have reduced flight distance from people. They have reduced aggression towards people, I think. But within dog groups, they show exaggerated aggression compared to their wild ancestors, and they show more intense dominance. And as I say, I'm not completely sure how to put these pieces together, but I have a suspicion that dominance might be part of the key to this. The dogs may recognize us human beings as dominant over them, and that may be part of how and why they are so motivated to do what we tell them to do. And I'm going to end by going back to Charles Darwin, 150 or nearly 150 years ago. And I mean, it's amazing to me, I mean, worshiping our ancestors, it's amazing to me that, I mean, this guy was working. He was trying to understand animal psychology before there was a science of psychology. I teach the history of psychology. The science of psychology didn't come into being until the 1880s. Darwin died in 1882. So he's trying to make sense of things. He didn't know anything about genetics. He's trying to make sense of things without any useful tools, right? I mean, it's just amazing. And yet sometimes he was able to come up with ideas that still resonate all this time later. And I'm going to show you, I know I'm teasing a little bit, I'm drawing it out a little bit, because what I'm going to share with you, I think would shock a great many readers today in 2020. Darwin published this in 1872. So what a radical thinker. Here's the quote. We see, oh, I'm sorry, hang on. So Darwin in The Descent of Man has several chapters where he's talking about the evolution of our psychology. Modern psychology didn't exist. The conceptual categories that he chooses to discuss probably wouldn't be discussed by modern scientists trying to answer these kinds of questions about the evolution of modern psychology. And so one of the concepts that he wants to discuss is religion, religious feeling, religious belief. I mean, 1872, and he wants to suggest that the feeling of religious belief might have evolved. And so we see some distant approach to this religious state of mind and the deep love of a dog for his master, associated with complete submission, some fear, and perhaps other feelings. Professor Braubach goes so far as to maintain that a dog looks on his master as on a god. I mean, I think a lot of people would be shocked by that today, never mind in 1872. It's an amazing, amazing thing to have expressed. And that picture, that is Charles Darwin. That is the youngest known picture of Charles Darwin. He was 7 years old, which is the year his mother died, and he was sent off to boarding school when his mother died, which must have been an unbelievable jolt in a poor boy's life. I don't know. I would love to know whether the painting was done before or after the death of his mother. I just don't know. So I think I've more or less used up my time. If I had spoken faster, I was going to share with you a little bit about how we use this knowledge to help dogs. We do an enormous amount of research on dogs living in shelters, and we try and use this knowledge of how people and dogs connect to each other to improve their chances of adoption and other things, improve their welfare. And the book that I referred to, which you could get or not get, is my book, Dog is Love: Why and How Your Dog Loves You. So thank you. And I think I've timed it tolerably well, and there is some time for questions, right, Nancy?
Yes, thank you very much.